Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to Global Perspectives on Nikkei in the 1940s, the Japanese-Brazilian Experience. I'm Jordan Stanger-Ross, Professor of History at the University of Victoria, and I'm the host for today's event. And it's a real pleasure to see so many people here and to see our speakers as well. This is part of an ongoing series that we're running on Nikkei experience from a global perspective. And so we'll have an event next month and the one after. So please look for that after enjoying today's event. On behalf of the University of Victoria, the host of this event, I acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory our university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanish people, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. I want to thank also our hosts at the University of Victoria, both the Center for Asia Pacific Initiatives, which is the long-standing host of the work of the Landscapes of Injustice Project, which is one of the organizers of this event, as well as the Past Wrongs, Future Choices Research Collective, which is bringing together these international scholars in conversation with that work of Landscapes of Injustice. And also the Center for Global Studies, which is a new friend of our work, new support for the work of Landscapes of Injustice and what we're calling PWFC, Past Wrongs, Future Choices, and is hosting this event today. So I look forward to learning a lot today. I've had a glance at the presentation slides of our presenters, and I know I'm going to learn a lot. The premise of this ongoing series that we're running is that historians and other scholars who have been working on the internment and dispossession of Japanese Canadians can learn a lot by coming into contact and exchange with scholars working on Nikkei experience in the rest of the world in places like Brazil. And I can speak to my own personal ignorance in those areas and how much I very much have to gain from today's presentation. And I'm really looking forward to that and to future sessions that allow us to do so. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So we have a translator here, John Hill, who is the handsome fellow in the striped shirt there that you can see. And so as questions arise in the course of the presentations today, we'd ask that you put your questions into the chat function. John's going to translate those to Portuguese for our speakers. You can still unmute, and when we get to your question in the Q&A, you could still unmute your video and wave, or even ask your question in English if you want. And the speakers will answer in English, but they'll have that translation into Portuguese. And I refuse to accept any apologies on the part of presenters for their English skills, because they're accommodating us for our lack of Portuguese skills. So I really thank them instead for the work that they're going to do to speak to us in ways that I can understand. And there are no apologies needed. It's my pleasure then to get straight into the presentations with our first speaker, Gustavo Takeshi Taneguchi, who's a sociologist with a doctorate in sociology from the University of Sao Paulo, which he received in 2015. In 2016, his PhD thesis, strongly related to Japanese immigration in Brazil, received an award from the Department of Sociology in Sao Paulo and was published as a book in 2019 with the title of Cotia, which is a region in Brazil, Immigration, Politics, and Culture. Gustavo will speak for 20 minutes, and then I'll give him the hook and we'll move to our next speaker. Gustavo, welcome.
Thank you, Professor Jordan. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to Ross and Professor Michael invitation. I also would like to thank the University of Victoria for hosting this event. And I think it's very important that we have more events like this so we can build and strengthen a global research network. So I'm very excited to be part of it. So thank you all for being here today. Uh, so I start my presentation following that broader question. What happened to the Japanese immigrants who were living in Brazil just after the Brazilian government declared war on Axis powers in 1942? What were the consequences of that action? And of course, there are many ways of answering that question, and I will present only how I see it, which means from the point of view of a Brazilian sociologist who's been studying the Japanese immigration in Brazil for the past couple of years, okay? So from that perspective, I would say that national state, politics, and markets are fundamental topics. It helps us to better answer our question, and that's why I will emphasize national state, politics, and markets. And I also would like to share with you some evidence that I've been working on in my recent studies, and hopefully we can discuss with you guys some possibilities of comparing different episodes of the Japanese diaspora in the 1940s. So to start, I think it's important to bring you some information on Japanese immigration in Brazil. So between 1908 and the mid-1970s, over 250,000 Japanese nationals migrated to Brazil. And in the year of 1940, most of them were settled at the states of São Paulo and Paraná, and especially they were concentrated at the northwest region of the state of São Paulo, which is highlighted here on the map. So when we have the declaration of war in 1942, this is the big picture of what was going on, the big picture of where the Japanese were settled in Brazil, okay? So moving on to national state, first topic, in the case of Brazil, when we look to Brazil's declaration of war in 1942, it was a kind of a culmination event because actually, even before that, even before 1942, Brazil already adopted several repressive actions against the immigrants, at least since the end of the 1930s. Okay, so people were living under an authoritarian regime and ruled by Getúlio Vargas. So this regime is called Estado Novo. Okay, so Vargas power in the year of with a coup and was deposed in 1945, just a few months after the end of the war. In that period, we had two new constitutions. Okay, so Vargas imposed several rules to control immigrants' lives. From 1938 to 1945, so Vargas adopted a policy called Nationalization Campaign. The Nationalization Campaign was a nationalist policy that included several restrictions against the foreigners in Brazil, especially those from the Axis powers. In 1945, Vargas is deposed and Brazil shifted to a new democratic regime. And in 1946, we had a new constitution, okay? And in the constitution, we had a Japanese immigration prohibition bill. It didn't pass, but it shows us how Brazilian state was dealing with the immigrant question at that time. And of course, it was a very turbulent period. The restart of the Japanese immigration in Brazil only happened in 1952. So political forces were transforming the Brazilian state continuously, and the relationship of the Brazilian state with the immigrants was also being transformed. So that's why I think it's important to discuss the national state. And if we combine this timeline here with some immigration data, we can better see what was going on in Brazil in 1942. Here we have data on the Japanese nationals in blue and other immigrants who entered Brazil from 1930 to 1960. And we can see that in 1942, when Brazil declared war on Axis powers, the entry of immigrants in Brazil was interrupted. It restarted only in 1945, and the Japanese immigration started only in 1952, 10 years later. So what happened in this period? I would like to emphasize three important events. The first one is the emergence of Japanese nationalist groups in 1946. And by the way, the cover picture of the invitation of our event today is from a nationalist group called Shindoren Mei. So it happened in 1946, the same year that happened the Japanese Immigration Prohibition Bill. Okay. And in 1947, we had the election of the first candidates of Japanese origin. So if we focus on the national state relationship with immigrants in that period, we can better discuss, I think, the Japanese experience in Brazil. And of course, we can affirm that the Brazilian state adopted several forms of control and repression against the Japanese nationals based on racial ideas of that time. And the Brazilian state itself led a nationalist campaign. So surely we must consider that national identities were under conflict at that time. But at the same time, the Japanese immigrants found ways to participate in Brazilian society. And that's why we should consider the existence of constraints, but also opportunities. And I will give you some examples here. So about the constraints, under Campanha de Nacionalização or Nationalization Campaign, Getúlio Vargas imposed several laws that affected the daily lives of the Japanese people. So it was very common to see Japanese immigrants being arrested because of speaking Japanese in public. Okay. Also, their political activities were banned, and the immigrant press was shut. Also, the consulates were shut. And the emergence of Japanese nationalist groups at that time in 1946 is strongly related to this kind of state repression against foreigners. Here we have a picture of some Japanese nationals in jail in Brazil. And yes, in Brazil, we also had incarceration camps. We still need more studies on that subject, but we already have some evidence that those camps actually existed. Here we have a cover picture of a newspaper from April 1942. It says that there is the first concentration camp in Brazil, and there are Germans and Japanese incarcerated. And here I brought you some references, just for those of you who might be interested. Most part of them discussed national identities, repression, and intolerance in Brazil. So in a sociological perspective, and from my personal perspective, I think national state is fundamental to better understand what happened to Japanese immigrants in that period. Moving to the second topic, politics, I would emphasize two important events that happened in the mid-1940s, the Japanese Immigration Prohibition Bill that I mentioned, and the election of candidates of Japanese origin for the first time. The Japanese Immigration Prohibition Bill was a kind of a reaction to the emergence of nationalist groups, Japanese nationalist groups. The bill didn't pass, but it showed us how some political groups, especially the political elites, tried to ban the Japanese immigration in Brazil, and they were based on racial ideas of that time, such as eugenics. So both the emergence of Japanese nationalist groups and the Prohibition Bill happened in 1946, and in the following year, 1947, surprisingly, the first candidates of Japanese origin were elected all municipal elections. And here I would like to briefly present you some evidence of the candidates of Japanese origin from my studies. So this is the state of São Paulo, and where most part of the Japanese immigrants were settled in the 1940s. And the colors on the map indicate the distribution of the candidates of Japanese origin who were elected. The first map shows data from 1947 to 1949, and we can see some changes for the period from 1950 to 1954, and also for the period of 1955 to 1958. So we can clearly see that over time, more and more candidates of Japanese origin were elected in the state of São Paulo. In 1955, the first city mayor of Japanese origin is elected, Tadao Tanaka, mayor of the city of Bastos. Okay, so this is what and this is the reference of my study. It was published the past year. So this is what I would highlight in the realm of politics. Apparently, in the case of the Japanese people, they suffered with political constraints, but also it coexisted with some opportunities. Okay, and last, moving to the economic realm, I would like to highlight two events that also illustrate the existence of both constraints and opportunities. The embargo of Axis Powers Company that happened from 1941, and the upward occupational mobility that Japanese nationals experienced starting from the 1930s. About the embargo of Axis Powers companies, Axis Powers owned companies in Brazil, well, the Brazilian government followed a list published in 1941 by the president of the United States. And this list was called the Proclaimed List of Certain Blocked Nationals. Okay, this list here. And it included some important Japanese immigrant-owned companies, especially the agricultural cooperatives that were extremely important to the majority of the Japanese immigrants at that time. So as the consequence of this embargo, what happened was the nationalization of immigrant-owned companies. And here I would like to mention the company that I studied in my PhD, Cooperativa Agrícola de Cotia, is highlighted here at the bottom of the third image, Cooperativa Agrícola de Cotia. Here we have a picture of its headquarters and its warehouse. The first one on my left here is a picture of its warehouse in the 1930s. And on my right, we have a picture of its headquarters in the mid-1970s. And here we have also the picture of its first president, the first president of the Cooperativa Agrícola de Cotia company, who was a Japanese national. And after 1942, he was replaced by a Brazilian-born president who ruled the company from 1942 to 1957. Okay. And in the mid-1980s, this company, Cooperativa Agrícola de Cotia, was considered one of the biggest agricultural companies in Latin America. It became a real big company. So when we look to the economic realm, we can observe political forces operating as well. And in this case, what happened in Brazil was directly tied to the broader geopolitical events, to the broader national forces from other countries, okay? And again, Japanese immigrants faced economic constraints, such as the embargo, but they also managed to move into the labor market in an upward mobility movement, as we can observe here in this chart. To finish, what I did here is a kind of an introduction of topics: national state, politics and markets, topics that I've been working on in the past years. So I also brought you some evidence from my personal studies, and I hope we can discuss some of the ideas and also the evidences. I hope we can discuss them with you, okay? So I think this is it. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. I want to introduce our second speaker now, and Leiko, you can. Are you sharing your screen, Leiko? You can maybe set that up as I. There we go. Oh, Luis says, okay, thank you. Leiko Matsubara Morales served as an advisor in the graduate program in Japanese language, literature, and culture at the University of Sao Paulo since 2010. Currently, she's the president of the Center for Japanese Brazilian Studies. She holds a bachelor's degree in Portuguese, Chinese, and Japanese literature, a master's degree in Japanese language and literature, and a doctorate in linguistics from the University of Sao Paulo. She did postdoctoral work at Sophia University in Japan. Leiko, it's my pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you, Professor Jordan. Initially, I would like to thank Professor Jordan and Michael for the great opportunity to work together on such a relevant but still underexplored topic in academia. I would also like to congratulate my colleagues, Monica and Gustavo, as well as the support of Lydia Yamashita from the Museum of Japanese Immigration. I also apologize for my lack of fluency in English. The purpose of this presentation is to give a brief overview of the Japanese education of immigrants during the war period. As far as possible, I am looking for primary source to better understand the history of Japanese education in Brazil. The subject of my presentation is the Japanese education of immigrants in the pre-war period. The first news we have of a Japanese language education institution is the famous Taisho Shogakko from 1950, which was located in the Liberdade district of São Paulo. However, numerically, pre-war Japanese schools have a strong connotation of a community school. Community school with support structures maintained by an association of Japanese, the Nihon Jinkai, of a secular nature isolated from urban centers. You can see is the slides. The Japanese schools was the center of the social cultural association's activities. Here we understand the notion of association in the context of a community of practice, as Lev and Wenger do, which gives us a very useful perspective for understanding this organization of people, formed in the early days of immigration, whose model was reproduced for decades within the Japanese community. Even in the post-war period, as a form of organization is keeping with its own ethnic and cultural origins, with its own purpose and knowledge, a somewhat opaque model for Brazilians to understand, but with taste knowledge shared only by the member of that community. However, this form of enterprise created by Japanese immigrants is very similar to the form of non-school education which exists in Japan, even before the transition from the feudal era to the modern era and the end of the Meiji era. That's to say, at the end of the 19th century, known as the Teragoya system. A secular education at first promoted by retired monks and samurais to children without access to studies, whose content was usually teaching arithmetic and writing kanji. This way of teaching was reproduced in Brazil in a different ways, which may be one of the reasons for the divergence in the number of education institutions. Given the diversity in age and the knowledge of students, given the diversity also in the capacity of the colony itself to manage the school. Some reaching close to 500 units. The results are also different, but it's possible to conjecture that the smaller number may be representing the official school recognized by the Brazilian government on that time. To put this into context, we can make some initial considerations about what the Japanese colony in Brazil was like. In the 1930s, although the siege against ethnic immigrant schools intensified and they were increasingly banned, we can see from the decrees that follow how they were dismantled. It's worth noting the large number of newspapers that were already circulating in the Japanese community that operated. It's worth to checking the starting and the closing dates, since they were all created at the weight of the formation of the colonies and the close at the outbreak of the Second World War. This fact will trigger an abrupt interruption of the community flow due to the fact that the immigrants didn't understand the Portuguese language. Not only that, but several impediments of contact between people were created, such as no agglomeration of more than 3 people, the use of safe conduct in case of locomotion, for example. In São Paulo, during our narrative interview investigations, we noticed a difference in the forms of prohibition, as there was a flexibility, not to say Brazilian way, in some schools to the detriment of others, due to good political relationship built with delegates and the majors, local authority of time who could authorize the operation of Japanese community schools, turning a blind eye to the teaching of the forbidden language. At the same time, as Japanese immigration to Brazil intensified in the 1930s. However, the period in which the largest number of Japanese immigrants came to Brazil, the Japanese Colonization Company, Kaigai Kogyo Kabushiki Gaisha, 1970, Bratak, a Sociedade Colonizadora do Brasil, 1929, and Brasport, Sociedade Algodoeira Brasil-Japão, 1936, these regions had a purchase of lands, introduction of immigrants, formation of colony nuclei, and incentive to the agriculture production of the sericulture. In these communities, there was subsidy for the creation of school and the medical service, construction of roads, which we can say differed in enormous degrees in relation to the colonies without this support, which faced all kinds of difficulties, from the construction of a physical headquarters for the Nihonjinkai Association to the lack of infrastructure. However, regardless of whether there was support or not, we highlight the activity organized in the Nihonjinkai, a true community of practice whose axis is the Japanese schools, a space not only for literacy, in the sense of memorizing Japanese characters, but also for the formation of Japanese character and spirit, in the sense of social practice, experience, and a daily basis and school. According to the Mori, while in the 1920s, education should be guided by the Brazilian as the principal and the Japanese as secondary. In the 1930s, due to the clash between two nationalisms, the Japanese promote a mentality that meets both the ideology of Japanese education This approach was called Wakon Hakusai, or the teaching of the Japanese language to serve as a common thread in the formation of the Japanese spirit, without losing the essence of the Japanese people, and the Portuguese language for the development of practical skills. The pedagogical practice attracted the attention of the authorities, as they were orchestrated with physical activity, pedagogy, school events. During the new state regime, several decrees came into force to carry out the ideas of building nationalism, whose ideary is the nation having a well-defined language and flag, to stimulate the feeling of belonging to identities values as the value of a nation. In the gap of the scarcity of school institution of the time, the ethnic immigrant schools fired in the ethnic schools, but as soon as nationalist regime was established and the country entered with the policy of building schools, the ethnic school gave up more and more spaces. Thus, the new state regime with the homogenization policy caused the erasure of foreign languages. We can see below a number of decrees that dismantled Japanese language education at various levels of involvement in school life, from the decree Prohibition teaching to children under the age of 14 in the interior of the country, with the exception of São Paulo and Santos city, which were at 11 years old. To the Japanese language teacher, passing a Portuguese language proficiency exam to enable him or her to take or some management of school unit. However, this was not only in the area of schools. There was an attempt to completely isolate the community by cutting off all forms of obtaining information in the Japanese language, from the prohibition of the circulation of Japanese newspapers to meeting of people with more than 3 people, for example. There is an infographic about the Japanese in rural areas. You can also notice how the state of São Paulo is densely populated by Japanese immigrants in 1935. Now, going back to the community, it's important to highlight a few points. Many testimonies we collected in 26 said that the Japanese textbooks on the time were superior to the Brazilian ones, as they reached higher levels. According to the 80 Years Commission, the community schools opened by the immigrants followed the standards of Japan that had as a system of 6 years of study, and some had up 8 years. About the level of teacher training, the 1932 survey, the survey shows that about 85% had graduated from the old gymnasium or higher level, which cannot be considered relatively high for the standard of the time. Brazilian Portuguese teachers were not always able to teach in remote, unpaved areas, while Japanese language teachers lived in their own communities. In addition to the textbooks, since the pre-war period, there was being a large circulation of books, ranging from entertainment novels through the Kaidan system, which were lent as a rotational basis, fostering literacy and not just memorizing or decoding kanji. It's a kind of grow up the literacy. It's very important to develop the language. When the teaching of Japanese language and the culture was banned in the public places, various stratagems were made to maintain the teaching, such as classes in homes with teachers, parents, and siblings, neighbors. The Japanese language classroom was set up by a Japanese language teacher. Decentration from large schools to smaller ones in branches or subsidiaries. School notebook and household notebook. hard to reach places in the foothills, in the valleys, in remote places. In the storehouses, pretending to be working on boxes of tomatoes. In sewing classes, the textbooks were hiding in the fabrics. It's also interesting to note in one of the testimony of a collaborator that before the war, he was a young Junisei boy who spoke Portuguese well, and when talking to a headmistress, he heard the following speech. I try to translate. She lamented that all the teachers said that the Japanese students only spoke Japanese, and she asked me to stop the students from speaking Japanese. The students don't try to learn Portuguese. An Italian teacher with a strong personality said, I'm of Italian descent. Why don't you Japanese people speak Portuguese? And I answered that the Latin culture and the Eastern culture are very different. The alphabet was different. Everything was different. We couldn't adapt immediately. Just like the Japanese eat with toothpicks, the notebook is not the side, but writing vertically, and the Buddhism was different from Catholicism. So when two different cultures meet, it takes a long time to fuse. So it's important to respect that time. Otherwise, you can make a mistake, bringing harmful consequence. That's how I convinced, he said. Important considerations are that the immigrants built several schools that in the nationalization process were being incorporated into the public sector. Many were donated to the public power. In some regions, it was the immigrants who led the demands to build a public school of higher level, also in regions considered peripheral. Since Brazil was poor in education institution, about 80% of the population was illiterate. Thank you very much. I'm on time.
Thank you so much, Leiko. Yes, on time. Wonderful. So very interesting to think about the two presentations together already. Let's introduce our third speaker, and then we'll have a conversation across the group. Monica Okamoto, and if maybe Leiko will mute your video, and Monica, if you want to unmute your video and begin your screen share, is Associate Professor at the Department of Modern Languages at the Federal University of Paraná. Among numerous publications and projects related to Japanese Brazilian diaspora, she was also the executive producer of an award-winning documentary, Nipo Brasileiros, the 9-episode series directed by Diego da Costa, Alexandre Nakahara, and Pedro Tinen, produced by Pieta Films. It addresses the professional trajectories of Japanese descendants in Brazil in different areas, highlighting the importance of their Japanese ancestry as well as challenges that they face due to this heritage. Monica, welcome.
Thank you, Jordan. I would like to thank all the organizers for this event. It's an honor to be here today. Well, in this presentation, I would like to begin by briefly describing the influence of the French discourse on Japan in Brazilian thought, and the extent to which the French view of Japan created a negative image of the Japanese in the imagination of Brazilian society. Many academics point to the North American presence as being central to the anti-Japanese manifestations in Brazil. But I argue that the basis of the racist discourse and the image of yellow pearl on Brazilian land were introduced at the end of the 19th century via France. Then I briefly discuss the persecutions suffered by Japanese immigrants during the war period and its post-war results. Finally, I examine the investigations carried out in 2013 by the True Commission in the city of São Paulo and the subsequent national and international impact. I would like to start by talking about the foreign influence in Brazil. It is a fact that Brazilian foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century was guided to support the United States in its role as a world power. This partnership is highlighted in academic works on anti-Japanese wartime movements. However, I would like to show today that in the case of Brazil, the discourses that racialized Asian immigrants came above all via French thoughts. In the early 1860s, well before the first Japanese immigrants arrived in Brazil, the influx of Asians into the country was already being discussed by Brazilian statesmen. At that time, some of the Brazilian references on the Japanese came from France, especially from the Revue dos Mondes, which throughout the mid-19th century published many works on Japan. It is worth noting that the Revue dos Mondes, highly respected by the Brazilian elite, was one of the most frequently consulted foreign periodicals in Brazil. It is also important to comment that the French influence on Brazilian thought and culture until 1930s was undeniable. Besides the review, several French publications reinforced the colonialist and ethnocentric thesis against the Japanese at those times. Such imperialist and hegemonic European posture started being threatened by the Japanese from the 1890s on, when France and other European countries began to focus on the new Japan, capitalist, military, competitive, and dangerous. It was the emergence of the ardent promoters of the so-called Yellow Peril. There were also many French discussions about Asian immigration and the fear of interbreed that could degenerate the period of the white race. For the colonists of the Revue dos Mondes, this yellow infiltration was made up of a bunch of miserable, disgusting, and rude people who were content with low wages. Finally, French eugenicists warned the government in the 1930s about the racial degeneration of crosses with incompatible or inferior races, demanding a program to restrict the entry of yellow and African immigrants. All this negative image of the Japanese conveyed by the French reverberated in the historiographical speeches of Brazilian statesmen who described the Japanese as a dissimulated. All this negative image of the Japanese conveyed by the French reverberated in the historiographical speeches of Brazilian statesmen who described the Japanese as a dissimulated, fanatical, hostile people to foreigners, proud, not assimilable, violent, xenophobic, and blind in their ostracism. It was in the midst of the influence of colonialist and racial theses coming from France that Brazil even with some fear, began the process of entry of Japanese immigrants in 1908. As of the 1920s, however, Brazil began to align itself economically with the United States. This Brazilian submission to Washington's orders directly affected the Nikkei community and Japanese investors who, throughout the 1920s, built through private and public initiatives numerous colonies in the Amazon regions and in the states of São Paulo and Paraná. With the entrance of Japan in the Second World War in 1941, the Brazilian government requested the closing of the diplomatic representations of the Axis countries, starting to consider the immigrants from these countries as hostile citizens. It led to the detention, imprisonment, freezing of assets, and eviction of Japanese immigrants and their descendants throughout Brazil. All Nikkei companies in Brazil with some Japanese capital had their board of directors replaced by Brazilian directors and suffered some form of threat or intervention. I will now talk about Shindo Reimei next, please. Shindo Reimei's post-war incident and the incarceration of Japanese immigrants on Anchieta Island. With the end of the war, Japanese immigrants and their descendants suffered another setback. Under the influence of the Shindo Reimei League of the Subject's Path was a terrorist movement created in the state of São Paulo by members of the Tokotai Suicide Squad and in the 1940s in Brazil. The members of the Shindo Reimei were Japanese immigrants who began to commit violent attacks against their countrymen who believed in the Japanese defeat in the Pacific War. Known as Kachigumi victorists, the members of Shindo Reimei preached and publicized the Japanese victory in the war. The Makegumi defeatists, who were also called dirty hearts, were those who were against this version and therefore believed in the defeat of Japan in the war. The Nikkei community became polarized, generating a tense climate of extreme violence that, over the following years, resulted in the murder of 23 leaders of the ethnic community. The Shindo Reimei case had the police intervention that arrested and imprisoned many Japanese between 1946 and 1947, were sent directly to the Anchieta Island prison on the north coast of São Paulo. And next, please. For Jacobowitz, quote, the roots of Shindo Reimei political violence lay in feelings of dispossession from both countries, which result in the production of a false counter-narrative to shore up their collective subjectivity against terrifying uncertainties, end of quote. In fact, in this troubled period of international conflict, many Japanese immigrants felt, in the words of Tomo Handa, a people abandoned by both the Japanese and Brazilian governments. On this Shindo Reimei theme, there are several works, such as that of Fernando Moraes, author of Dirty Hearts, whose English version was released in 2021, with a critical introduction by the translator Seth Jacobowitz, The book Shindorei, Terrorism and Repression by Rogério Dezen. Osamu Toyama, a journalist of Japanese community, also expressed his point of view in 100 Years of Running Waters. Finally, the film Dirty Hearts by director Vicente Amorim and the documentary Yami no Ichinichi, The Crime That Shook the Japanese Colony in Brazil by documentary filmmaker Mario Jun Okuhara. And finally, I would like to talk about the True Commission. Next, please. In 2013, the True Commission of the State of São Paulo, Rubens V, in a public hearing, acknowledged that the Brazilian state committed gross human rights violations against Japanese Brazilian families during the governments of Getúlio Vargas and Eurico Gaspar Dutra. They also admitted injustice, imprisonment, and torture committed in the post-war period against Japanese immigrants and their descendants. The creation of the National True Commission was seen by the Brazilian and international press as a Brazilian effort to redress the injustice, violence, and racial prejudice committed by the Brazilian state during the authoritarian period. This commission investigated the violation committed during the Getúlio Vargas dictatorship, which through a series of decrees imposed restrictive measures on the Japanese community. According to the True Commission, these political measures caused the emergence of fake news about the war and consequently the polarization of the Japanese community into victors and defeatists in the post-war period. Rosa Cardoso, a member of the National True Commission, apologized on behalf of the Brazilian government to the Japanese community for the violence committed by the state against the Japanese. The case achieved international impact and thus prompted Mario Jun Okuhara, documentary filmmaker and proponent of the public hearing, to request a retraction from the Ministry of Justice. In 2015, the request reparation was finally filed with the Ministry of Justice, which admitted injustice, racism, and social discrimination against Japanese immigrants. According to the text of the document, the silence and oppressed voices of the Japanese had finally been represented. Quote, besides shedding light on issues essential to the defense of the democratic state of law, transitional justice, freedom of the press, access to information, and the fight against racism. End of quote. At first, there is an illusion of reckoning and justice effected between the Brazilian state and the Nikkei community. However, it is relevant to mention that there was not a unanimous position of support for the request for retraction with the Ministry of Justice, as much of the Japanese community refused to join the retraction request moved by Okuhara. According to scholars from the Japanese Brazilian community, Saito and Kumasaka, the case of Shindorei resulted in serious public disturbance within Brazilian society. Apparently, this conflict not only triggered a split within the Japanese colony, but also caused great discomfort among the Nikkei community, victorists or defeatists alike. In the view of many Japanese Brazilians, the Japanese image of orderly workers had been tarnished by the incident, and this was an episode in the history of Japanese immigration that many leaders of Nikkei organizations wanted to keep silent until they were completely forgotten. On the side of the Brazilian government and the international bodies, such as the National Association of Japanese Canadians, which supported the redress requested by Okuhara, the public hearing of the True Commission symbolized a reckoning with the past. In conclusion, the emergence of transitional justice in Brazil has challenged the greater involvement of jurists, academics, and the community in the cases investigated by the True Commissions. However, even though the public hearing has a partial and fragmented understanding of the history of persecution and violations of human rights against the Japanese, discussing this topic with Professor Matt James, he believes that the True Commission at least initiated the demands for apology and redress in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you for all three presentations. I wonder if the three presenters could all unmute their video, and then maybe we'll try a bit of a strange hybrid format. So I wonder if, I think our first question is from Laura Saimoto. I wonder if Laura could unmute her video. Hi, Laura. But maybe John could ask the question for us in Portuguese. So Laura will be the face of the question, but John the voice. Is that a reasonable approach? Is Laura there? There's Laura. Hi, Laura. And John, do you want to provide Laura's question for the speakers in Portuguese?
Okay.
I have to find it in the chat where you entered it. Yeah.
So, Laura's question, a pergunta da Laura era sobre a tia-avó dela, que dava aula nas escolas japonesas, de língua japonesa no Brasil, e que ela quis saber se o ensino fosse como alternativa às escolas brasileiras ou era suplementar. E a lei correspondeu que era suplementar. Normalmente, o ensino da língua japonesa foi posterior às aulas em escolas brasileiras. So I translated the question in writing, and then Leiko has already given an answer.
I'm realizing, of course, the non-Portuguese speaking audience doesn't know what the question was. So Laura, maybe you should unmute also, Laura, and just ask your question, and then that'll also give the speakers a moment to think about answering orally as well.
Yeah, I asked Professor Reiko, hi, about because I've done a lot of work with like the Japanese language school here in Vancouver, and I've done a lot of research on it, and I went to Japanese school, and my like Obasan taught Japanese school outside of Sao Paulo. So I was wondering, in Canada, the Japanese schools became a second language school about 1920. And so then they go to regular school and then go to Japanese school after school. And so I just asked Professor Reiko, like, was it the same in Brazil? And she said, seems like it.
I don't know if I can answer your question in English, but I can try. We have two concepts of the foreign language as a second language, like you say, and the foreign language. In Brazil, in this case, is foreign language. So it's a very complementary subject in the curriculum in the school. But before the Second War, the Japanese people studied as a mother language, for a first language, even living in Brazil. So after the Second War, there is a big difference between before and after. The people study Japanese as a heritage language. Is another concept of the Nakajima Kazuko, say everywhere, maybe in Japan, in Canada too, is a little bit different because in Brazil we have a sixth generation, Rokusei, not Nisei, not Sansei, but Rokusei. So we can understand that the Japanese teaching is like a foreign language. For the Nikkei people, they usually understand that there is a differential point that study language by heart. I don't know how to say it, but sorry, my poor English. Desculpa, John, se você preferir, eu falo em português e você traduz para a gente.
Wakarimashita. Daijoubu desu.
Retana ego de musho wakarimasen.
I guess this is a second question related to this, and it's really for the whole panel. Thank you everyone for the information. It was very interesting. I'm wondering if before the war there was some kind of flowering of a consciousness of like a Brazilian citizenship. Like in Canada, among the Nikkei, there was a kind of direction change after World War I. And the flowering of consciousness of being a Canadian started to emerge in the 1920s. And I'm wondering if there was some kind of similar in Brazil, a similar emergence of Brazilian consciousness around citizenship.
Só vou traduzir. Diz que houve florescimento de orgulho nessa questão de ser canadense nos anos 20. E quis saber se houve um movimento parecido no Brasil, entre a comunidade nipo-brasileira.
Uma questão que eu acho bastante delicada e eu vou tentar falar em português para não errar, né? Eu acho que já há uma diversidade muito grande na comunidade. Eu acho que falta estudos ainda, né? Por exemplo, eu ia apresentar também um excerto de um Nikkei falando, eu escrevi no chat, né, sendo contra essas formas muito, vamos dizer assim, pautado nos preceitos de éditos imperiais, né, do período Meiji, muito assim voltado para a reverência, né, ao imperador, ao Yakoko, né, referência aos pais. Então, já há uma diversidade na comunidade antes da guerra. No pós-guerra, há um divisor de água muito grande, né? A comunidade realmente vai decidir pela permanência definitiva no Brasil, né? O Brasil deixa de ser um lugar transitório, vai ser um lugar permanente, então o foco para estudo não será mais a língua japonesa, nem tanto a cultura japonesa, mas a língua portuguesa. Porém, a maioria quer preservar, né? Por isso, as escolas públicas ainda eram boas, né? As crianças iam no período alternativo estudavam japonês. John, você quer traduzir, senão vai ficando extenso, né?
So the answer is that there's a lot of diversity within the community. And so Leiko had pointed out that even in the period when there was teaching about the reverence for the emperor and these edicts, there was some criticism within the community. But a real moment of change was after the war, when many people in the community finally decided that Brazil was not a transitory state, that they were not here simply for a time before going back to Japan, and that they were going to remain. And at that point, there was an emphasis on part of the community in learning Portuguese, in integrating into the community, and and that's taking pride in the Brazilian aspect.
Obrigado.
Só para complementar, há então essa consciência também de integrar mais a sociedade brasileira E muitas pessoas deixaram de estudar japonês, né? A gente tem uma falsa impressão que o Brasil teve a imigração contínua, diferentemente de outros países. O Brasil teve continuamente imigrantes no pós-guerra. Então, de uma certa forma, nós temos um ensino de japonês bastante atuante, bem intenso. Então, as pessoas confundem, né, achando que o Brasil tem um histórico de bom ensino. Na verdade, é que houve uma reposição de pessoas novas chegando no Brasil também. Então, acho que nesse ponto se parece com o Canadá. Então, acho que o professor Teiichi Suzuki tem uma pesquisa muito importante no pós-guerra. Ele mostra que apenas 11% das crianças Nikkeis em fase escolar iam tanto para a escola japonesa quanto para a brasileira, e a maioria já tinha optado para a escola brasileira. Razão por que muitos Nikkeis não falam japonês.
So today, many Japanese Brazilian descendants don't speak Japanese because at that point after the war, there was a clear preference for Portuguese language learning and putting aside of Japanese language learning. But it would be wrong to think that immigration stopped. What was happening was that new immigrants were coming in after the 1950s, and their children then would get Japanese language education because they were part of the, just to have the transition. But as the author Leiko mentioned, found that at a certain point, only 11% of the Japanese community was opting for bilingual education, and the rest were all for Portuguese-only education.
Thank you, Leiko and John. John's doing wonderful help to us here. We have a question from Robson Mori that was posed in Portuguese, and already John has translated it to me in the chat. But Robson, if you wanted to unmute and ask the question that you have in Portuguese, and then I can translate it for the English audience, and we'll give John a little break here. Robson, if you wanted to, go ahead. Oh, John, Robson indicated he couldn't understand my suggestion. So.
Robson, ele pediu para você fazer sua pergunta em português e eu fiz a tradução para ele. Ele vai falar para o grupo que não fala português em inglês. Você pode repetir a sua pergunta que escreveu no chat?
Usando áudio? Licença. Obrigado pelo evento e parabéns pelas apresentações de todos. A minha pergunta é para o professor Gustavo Taneguchi. Se podemos relacionar a ascensão econômica e política de parte dos nipo-brasileiros, né, empresários, políticos, com a ideia de minoria modelo, uma minoria que serve de exemplo para o restante da população majoritária, nesse sentido. É isso.
Thank you, Robson. And just to translate, the translation I have from John is, excuse me for asking my question in Portuguese. First, congratulations for your presentations. My question is for Professor Gustavo Taneguchi, and he asks, can we relate the economic and political rise on the part of Japanese Brazilians as an example of the so-called model minority?
Okay. Thank you, Robson. That is a very good question. I think that the minority model thesis can be understood as analytical, but also a political perspective. It was, as far as I know, it was conceived in the case of North America by North American scholars. So this perspective has racial implications in the way that it was considered. It is related to history of the North American societies and how they managed to interpret the mobility and ascension of the Asians in North America. In the case of Brazil, I think that the Japanese immigrants experienced economic and political mobility, yes, but I'm not so sure if the model itself, the minority model itself, can successfully translate what happened to the Japanese in Brazil, because here we had a very different racial and social configuration. So by one side, yet, the Japanese suffered economic and political mobility. Compared to other immigrants, they have, the broader society has an image of the Japanese as a successful group. But when we move to the minority model thesis, we have some implications that we need to understand in order to compare different realities. So I'm kind of suspicious to use the model, the minority model itself. But yes, the Japanese suffered economic and political mobility in Brazil, and that is a very good point to start a comparison.
Gustavo, while you're there, maybe I'll just add a question that came from Art Mickey, who mentioned that when he attended the PANA conference in Sao Paulo, he was impressed by the number of Japanese Brazilians in national politics, I guess today or recently. So I wonder if this is something you've observed, and whether you can comment on whether that representation has increased over time since the period that you were studying, or what the historical trajectory, I guess, is over time from then till now, roughly.
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah, that's also a good question. Well, in the past years, some people are saying that the presence of the Japanese politicians had decreased if we compare to the 1980s and 1970s. But I think it's important to consider that from the 1960s to the end of the 1980s, Brazil was ruled by another dictatorship, a military dictatorship. So the elections were changed. There were no political parties, and the hand of the leftist parties. So maybe that affected the broader scenario, affected somehow the election of Japanese candidates after the 60s. But yes, until the 1990s, the presence of Japanese politicians was very common. In the past years, I have noticed a decrease of their presence. So maybe the greatest big wave of political insertion starts in the 1940s and gets stronger in the 1950s. And in the 1960s, we have some implications. We have some changes on how the democratic system in Brazil worked. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but yes, although we have some presence of Japanese politicians until today, it decreased a little bit in my point of view.
Thank you, Gustavo. I want to direct the next question toward Monica. It's a question that comes from Vivian Rignerstadt. And Monica, I just put it into translation that John has provided into your chat. But Vivian, if you want to unmute, you could ask the question for the benefit of the English speaking audience as well.
Okay. Well, actually, I was thinking to...
Oh, sure. Oh, you're going to answer that. You're going to speak to that last question before we get to this next one?
Yes, because I was reading here, so I guess it's easier. It's okay?
Are you talking about Vivian's question?
It is your question, I guess. I have a question for Monica. I'm wondering whether she sees the French language, yellow pearl,
okay,
blah,
sure.
blah, blah.
Sure. Okay, so then I can ask that. I'll ask that in English, and then after you answer that, Monica, maybe we'll ask Vivian to unmute and ask her question. So yes, I put a question in chat that I can't remember whether I put it to the entire group, but I had asked, Monica was emphasizing French language, yellow peril discourse, and so I was wondering what the relationship between that and the Anglo world, similar forms of racism that were influential in British Columbia were, and whether she views those as interconnected or quite separate discussions of anti-Asian racism.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I guess the French language yellow peril discourse focuses on colonialist and ethnocentric vision. And in the English yellow peril discourse focus on political imperialist view and economic issues. I was trying to find the book about the yellow peril. Oh, here. This is an American translation, Perigo Amarelo, Yellow Pearl, from William Brown. It's an English, how can I say, English discourse about yellow pearl. And what I realized it was that the English discourse, it is more, how can I say, focused on immigration, political issues, economic issues. It is more imperialist view. And the French yellow period discourse was more racial and cultural influence. I guess according to Mário de Andrade, he's a writer, a Brazilian writer, he said that the French influence in Brazil was less dangerous than United States influence, because the United States influence wasn't influence, it is domination. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I guess it's, I don't know how to relate this with racism in places like British Columbia. I guess I have to think about more.
Yeah, big project. Thank you. So then the second question from Vivian maybe relates more closely to your documentary work, Monica, which is why I was thinking of you. If you can find it in the chat that I sent you. And then Vivian, if you want to unmute, and this will probably be our last question before we wrap up, and it's fitting it's about legacies.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for the presentations. What has interested me in the past little while working with landscapes of injustice is the legacies of what happened during World War II, particularly amongst the younger people, but also the legacies of silence. People don't talk about things. Silence, but at the same time, resilience, anger that's often hidden, mental health. I'm wondering what you see as legacies today, particularly amongst the younger generations.
Well, this is a very interesting question, because about apology policies and redress is a new topic for me, and I started working on a few months ago. And I've read several texts, especially by Professor Matt James and Jordan, and I have participated in a research group debating the historical context of Japanese in the war period. And I realized that these analyses can be a lot more complex in terms of apology and redress demands. And about legacy, an interesting side of this whole debate about persecution and racism against yellow people, raised by the media in the 2013 in Brazil, was the gradual emergence of young Nikkei, of current generations who seem engaged in combating any kind of racial prejudice in social media and so on. So I believe that this is the legacy, maybe, because even my students used to talk about more about this kind of issues, racial racism and racial prejudice against Japanese, especially after pandemic situation. I guess this is Asian problem around the world, magnified. So in the case of Brazil, I guess we have this kind of how can I say, interest from young people about the past more than the old generation. I don't know if I answered the question.
Thank you, Monica. That was good. That's given me more to think about.
Okay. Oh, I believe one more thing, that I believe the role of the True Commission as transitional justice was to drive the case so that it would be not forgotten or ignored altogether. So to be honest, I didn't know much about this True Commission in the depth until I started to do this research. So I guess it is a kind of legacy too, because you start to think about more future generation don't repeat this kind of thing. That's it. Thank you.
Monica, there was a question just now on from Fabricio Tello that John's translated, that relates just very directly to the Truth Commission. I don't know if you would have an answer to that question. I can read it in English while you look at it in Portuguese, perhaps. But Fabricio had written, "Thank you all for your amazing presentations. My question is for Monica Okamoto. You mentioned that Rosso Cardoso, a member of the National Truth Commission, apologized for the Brazilian state's wrongdoings against the Japanese community. However, different than the Sao Paulo Truth Commission, the National Truth didn't address the human rights violations against the Japanese community in its final report." And he asks, do you know why this happened?
Well, actually, I tried to analyze the final report of National Commission and the São Paulo Commission, and I couldn't find anything about this this case, the public hearing, and I found this is really strange. And I don't know, I guess in São Paulo we have more how can I say, more attention from audience, because there are more Japanese people living in São Paulo. So I heard that some Japanese immigrants and descendants in the north, especially in Tomé Sul, Pará, they suffered some kind of a persecution during the war. I'm not sure if there was internment in Tomé Sul. I was planning, I was intending to travel to Pará in January, but the situation of the pandemic situation is not good in Brazil now, so I give up. Anyway, I guess the point is Paraná and São Paulo, we have more Japanese people, Japanese population and descendants, so maybe that's why I don't know, sorry, I'm not sure. Actually, Mario Okuhara is here in this presentation. He was the proponent of the audience. So I guess he can answer better than me about this question. I don't know if he's here or not.
I'm not sure. We're at time, so I think we'll have to. Many of these conversations require ongoing discussion. I'm really intrigued by the three presentations, especially in relation with one another. Thinking about the Gustavo's presentation and this very remarkable entry into elected office of Nikkei in the post-war period, especially in light of what Leiko told us about the cultural and linguistic distinctiveness of the community in the period right before that time, and Monica, your discussion of the divisions within the community. So putting those three together to me is an interesting puzzle that I'm left thinking through. And I look forward to many future conversations with each of you. Thank you so much to the presenters and to the hosts, to CFGS and to Mike and to everyone for allowing us to do this, and to the audience for your wonderful questions and for moving the discussion forward. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Obrigado.